Imagine a place where books were worth more than gold, where university students debated philosophy centuries before Oxford existed, a kingdom so rich in knowledge that its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Then, imagine Europe erasing it from history. This is the story they never taught you. There's a version of history that most of us learned in school. It goes something like this. Europe had the Renaissance. Europe had the great universities. Europe preserved knowledge while the rest of the world stumbled through darkness. Africa, in particular, was painted as a continent without history, without achievement, without civilization. Just tribes and wilderness waiting to be discovered and civilized by European explorers. But what if almost everything about that story was a lie? What if there was a kingdom in Africa that had universities when most of Europe was still illiterate? What if there were libraries so vast they rivaled anything in the ancient world? What if scholars there were performing eye surgeries, calculating astronomical charts, and writing thousands of books while Europe was burning witches? The truth is, there was such a place. And the reason most people have never heard of it is not an accident. It's one of the most successful cover-ups in history. If you've ever wondered what else they didn't teach you in history class, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're about to uncover stories that will change everything you thought you knew about the medieval world. Let's dive in. Growing up, most of us learned about the Middle Ages as Europe's time to shine. We heard about knights and castles, about the Crusades and the slow crawl toward the Renaissance. Africa, if it was mentioned at all, was just the continent where slaves came from. A place without its own story, waiting in the wings of someone else's history. But here's what they didn't tell you. While Europe was fragmenting after Rome's fall, while literacy rates plummeted and libraries burned, something extraordinary was happening on the other side of the Sahara Desert. Cities were rising, universities were opening their doors, scholars were gathering in numbers that would make any medieval European city jealous. The Mali Empire, stretching across West Africa from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the Sahara, became one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilizations of its time. And at its heart sat a city that would become legendary, though most history books seem to have forgotten it. That city was Timbuktu. Now, if you've heard of Timbuktu at all, it's probably as a punchline, a metaphor for the middle of nowhere, the edge of the earth. But using Timbuktu that way is like calling Harvard a community college, or treating the Library of Congress like a roadside bookshop. It's not just wrong, it's the opposite of truth. Timbuktu sits where the Niger River bends northward, a meeting point between the Sahara Desert and the fertile lands to the south. For centuries, it was a trading post where caravans brought salt from the north and took gold, ivory, and knowledge back across the sand. But everything changed in 1324, when the Emperor of Mali decided to go on a pilgrimage. His name was Mansa Musa, and he's been called the richest person who ever lived. When he traveled to Mecca, he didn't go quietly. He brought 60,000 people with him. He brought camels carrying tons of gold. And he spent so freely in Cairo that he crashed their economy for a decade. Gold became so common that its value plummeted. It took years for the markets to recover. But Mansa Musa wasn't just showing off. He came back from that journey with something more valuable than all his gold. He brought architects, scholars, and teachers. He brought books, thousands of them. And he had a vision: to turn Timbuktu into the greatest center of learning the world had ever seen. The university he built, centered around the Sankor Mosque, would grow to hold 25,000 students. 25,000. That's larger than many universities today. And this was in the 14th century. Students came from across Africa and beyond, traveling for months to study law, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and theology. The city transformed. Wealthy families built private libraries. Book traders set up shops, where rare manuscripts sold for fortunes. Scribes worked day and night copying texts, preserving knowledge, creating new works. Poets recited in the squares. Lawyers debated in the courtyards. Doctors taught surgical techniques that Europe wouldn't discover for centuries. This wasn't a primitive village. This was a cosmopolitan intellectual capital where scholars lived like kings and books were status symbols more precious than jewels. The scholars of Timbuktu didn't just preserve old knowledge. They created new understanding, pushed boundaries, and recorded everything in manuscripts that still exist today. These weren't simple religious texts. They were sophisticated academic works covering every field imaginable. Take medicine, for example. Manuscripts detail surgical procedures for cataracts, describe antiseptic techniques using local plants, and document treatments for diseases with a precision that shows deep anatomical understanding. Some texts describe procedures that Europe wouldn't attempt for another 200 years. In astronomy, scholars calculated the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, and created detailed star charts. They understood that the Earth was round, mapped trade routes using celestial navigation, and taught mathematical concepts that parallel what was being discovered in the Islamic world and would later make its way to Europe. The legal scholars of Timbuktu created a sophisticated system of jurisprudence that influenced governance across West Africa. They wrote commentaries on Islamic law, but adapted them to local customs, creating a unique fusion that governed everything from property rights to marriage contracts to international trade agreements. One scholar, a brilliant legal mind named Ahmed Baba, owned a personal library of 1,600 books. When Moroccan invaders captured him later in life, he lamented that this was actually the smaller portion of his collection. Think about that for a moment. One man owned more books than most European monasteries of the same period, and Ahmed Baba wasn't unique. Wealthy families competed to build the largest libraries. Scholars traveled between cities comparing manuscripts, debating interpretations, and copying rare texts. The book trade was serious business. A single rare manuscript could sell for more than a herd of cattle or a house in the city. What makes this even more remarkable is that we're not talking about a handful of books. Conservative estimates suggest that Timbuktu and the surrounding region held 700,000 manuscripts. Some scholars believe the number exceeded 1 million. These weren't pamphlets or short texts. Many were hundreds of pages long, meticulously copied by hand, illustrated with beautiful calligraphy and geometric designs. The manuscripts were written in multiple languages. Arabic served as the scholarly language, but texts also appeared in Fulani, Songhai, and other local languages. They covered poetry and literature, historical chronicles of kingdoms and battles, scientific treatises on everything from botany to chemistry, business records showing complex trade networks, and philosophical works debating ethics, logic, and the nature of knowledge itself. This was Africa producing knowledge, not just consuming it. This was African intellectuals contributing to human understanding, while Europe claimed they were primitive. The manuscripts weren't kept in one central library. They were distributed across hundreds of private family collections, mosque libraries, and scholarly institutions. This actually helped preserve them, because there was no single target for destruction. Families treated these manuscripts as treasured heirlooms, passing them down through generations. Owning books was a mark of prestige and education. When a scholar died, his library would be divided among his children, who would add their own acquisitions and continue the tradition. Some families still possess collections that go back 500 years or more. The care taken with these books was extraordinary. Scribes used special inks that wouldn't fade, treated paper and leather to resist the harsh climate, and developed preservation techniques that kept manuscripts readable for centuries. They built special boxes, wrapped volumes in protective cloth, and stored them in dry rooms where temperature and humidity could be controlled. What did all these manuscripts contain? The diversity is staggering. There were medical texts explaining how to treat snake bites using specific plant combinations, how to set broken bones, and how to compound medicines from local herbs. Mathematical manuscripts showed advanced algebra, geometry used in architecture and trade, and calculation methods for everything from dividing inheritances to measuring land. There were astronomical tables predicting lunar cycles for decades in advance, star catalogues identifying constellations, and navigation guides for crossing the Sahara using celestial markers. Historical chronicles documented the rise and fall of kingdoms, recorded genealogies of ruling families, and described major events with the kind of detail that historians dream of finding. Legal manuscripts filled entire libraries. They covered contract law, criminal justice, property rights, and family law. They showed a sophisticated understanding of evidence, testimony, and judicial procedure. Poetry and literature flourished in both Arabic and local languages, with works ranging from love poetry to epic tales of heroes and battles. And here's what should make everyone pause. This was happening at the same time Europe was going through what it called the Renaissance, supposedly rediscovering learning after the Dark Ages. Except Timbuktu never had a Dark Age. The lights of learning never went out. While European scholars were just beginning to collect Greek and Roman texts, African scholars were producing original research and building on centuries of their own intellectual tradition. So what happened? How did a civilization this advanced, this rich in knowledge, simply disappear from popular history? The beginning of the end came in 1591, when Moroccan forces, armed with guns and cannons, invaded the Songhai Empire. Timbuktu fell, and though the city survived, its golden age ended. Scholars were killed, exiled, or enslaved. Ahmed Baba himself was taken in chains to Morocco, where he spent years in captivity before returning to a diminished city. The great universities declined, trade routes shifted, political instability made scholarship dangerous, but the manuscripts survived, hidden by families who understood their value even as the city's prominence faded. Then came European colonization, and this is where the story gets deliberately ugly. When French, British, and other European powers carved up Africa in the 19th century, they needed to justify what they were doing. They needed a narrative that explained why it was acceptable to conquer, enslave, and exploit an entire continent. That narrative required Africa to be primitive, backward, without history or civilization. A dark continent waiting for the light of European culture and Christianity. The existence of places like Timbuktu, with their universities and libraries and sophisticated societies, completely contradicted this story. So, colonial administrators, missionaries, and historians simply wrote it out of the record. They dismissed African achievements, claimed that anything sophisticated must have been brought by Arab traders or other outsiders, and taught generations of students that Africa had no history worth mentioning before Europeans arrived. Manuscripts were ignored or destroyed. When colonizers encountered libraries, they often burned them, considering them worthless or dangerous. Local people learned to hide their books, burying them in the desert, sealing them in walls, storing them in secret locations where the colonizers wouldn't find them. This wasn't accidental ignorance. This was systematic erasure. European scholars knew about Timbuktu's history. Early travelers had written accounts describing the city's wealth and learning, but those accounts were dismissed, forgotten, or explained away. The narrative of African primitiveness was too useful to abandon just because it was false. For centuries, families in Timbuktu and surrounding areas kept their manuscripts hidden, passing down the knowledge of where they were buried, who owned which texts, and why they mattered. They became guardians of a history that the world had decided to forget. The 20th century brought a slow rediscovery. African independence movements sparked new interest in pre-colonial history. Scholars, both African and international, began seriously investigating what had been dismissed or hidden, and families began bringing their manuscripts out of hiding. What they found astonished everyone. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, some damaged by time and insects and humidity, but many still readable. The sheer scale of it forced historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about African history. Preservation efforts began in earnest. The Ahmed Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research was established to collect, preserve, and study the manuscripts. Private family libraries opened their doors to researchers. Digitization projects started photographing texts so scholars worldwide could study them. But the threats haven't ended. In recent years, Islamic extremist groups have targeted the manuscripts, considering them heretical or idolatrous. When militants occupied Timbuktu in 2012, they began burning manuscripts. Brave locals, risking their lives, smuggled thousands of texts to safety, hiding them in basements and smuggling them out of the city in rice sacks and vegetable trucks. Climate change threatens the manuscripts too. Increasing heat and humidity, combined with insects and deterioration, means that preservation is a race against time. International organizations have stepped in to help, but resources are limited, and there are so many texts still unstudied, uncatalogued, and at risk. Every year, researchers discover something new in these manuscripts. Medical techniques that challenge assumptions about African medicine. Mathematical concepts that show sophisticated understanding. Historical accounts that fill in gaps in our knowledge of African kingdoms and trade networks. Each discovery adds another piece to a picture that was deliberately shattered. This isn't just an interesting historical footnote. The erasure of Timbuktu's history has had real consequences that echo into the present. When generations of children, both African and non-African, are taught that Africa had no great civilizations, no intellectual achievements, no contributions to human knowledge, it shapes how they see the world. It shapes how African children see themselves, robbing them of a proud intellectual heritage that should inspire confidence and ambition. It shapes how non-African people view Africa, allowing stereotypes and prejudices to flourish unchallenged. And it impoverishes everyone's understanding of human history, because we're missing huge pieces of the story of how knowledge developed and spread across the world. Education systems worldwide are slowly beginning to incorporate this history, but it's an uphill battle. Textbooks are slow to change. Curricula are locked in old patterns, and many people have invested their entire worldview in the idea that civilization and progress flowed in only one direction, from Europe outward. The manuscripts of Timbuktu prove otherwise. They show that intellectual achievement has never been the property of one race, one continent, or one culture. They show that the human drive to learn, to record, to understand, and to teach transcends geography and circumstances. And they show us what we lose when powerful people decide that some histories are worth remembering and others are better forgotten. So here's what we know now. In the 13th through 16th centuries, while Europe was slowly climbing out of its medieval period, West Africa had a thriving intellectual capital. Timbuktu had universities before most of Europe, libraries that held more books than European collections, and scholars producing original work in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. This kingdom of scholars was real. The manuscripts exist. The evidence is undeniable. Yet it was deliberately written out of history because it didn't fit the story that colonial powers needed to tell. The families who protected these manuscripts for generations, hiding them from those who would destroy them, kept alive a truth that the world is only now beginning to acknowledge. Their courage preserved not just books, but proof that history is far richer and more complex than we were taught. This story isn't just about the past. It's about what happens when powerful people decide which histories get told and which get buried. If this opened your eyes, do me a favor. Share this video with someone who loves history. Let's make sure this story reaches the people who need to hear it. And if you want more hidden histories that'll blow your mind, check out the video we've linked above. Subscribe so you never miss when we uncover the next truth they didn't want you to know. What other forgotten civilizations should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning everything they taught you.